Okay, thank you, Prof. Hi, guys. My name is Adila, and today Shazad and Richard and I will be discussing and going through important forms in primary healthcare. The first one we're going to start with, hold on, just, how do I go now? Oh, okay, so the first one we're going to start with is the J88 form, and I'm just going to give you guys a little background on the J88 form. The J88 is a document generated by the Department of Justice to be utilized in our South African courts as the preferred method of adducing evidence or gathering evidence in criminal matters when a complainant has sustained an injury. The J88 form serves as a crucial piece of evidence in cases where interpersonal violence has taken place, such as rape, assault, or attempted murder, etc. The next slide just briefly goes through when should the J88 form be filled in regards to a timeline. So when a patient arrives at casualty, they will need to be triaged and assessed as either an assault case, a child abuse case, or a rape case. In the case of an assault, firstly, our jobs would be to treat and stabilize the patient. And thereafter, if the patient or victim wants to make a case and they have a J88 form that is certified and on them, and you actually have time to fill in the J88 form, then you may do so. If not, if you don't have time and they have the form on them, you would need to make just thorough notes so that you can arrange for another time for the J88 form to be filled in. If the patient wants to make a case but doesn't have the form, then you would just treat the patient, make thorough notes, and then advise the patient on how to obtain a J88 form at a police station. In the case of rape, you would stabilize the patient, and if the patient doesn't need any stabilization, you would then just refer the patient to the nearest rape crisis center or police station. If you are suspecting child abuse, you would need to report it as soon as possible. You would treat and stabilize the patient and then call the child protection unit or refer to the nearest police station. So next, we're just going to talk about some principles for the correct completion of a J88 form. The patient should firstly register a case docket via the case investigating officer at their police station. And the patient should give informed consent by means of a signed and witnessed Form SAP 308, which is a legal requirement in sexual assault cases, and you would not be able to complete a J88 form in a sexual assault case if the SAP 308 form is not present or attached to the J88. Patients should then present to their healthcare practitioners for examinations if they haven't previously been examined on initial presentation, and then just fill out the J88 form. The SAP 308 form must be retained by the doctor or a copy of it in the patient's file. And according to the South African justice system, the J88 form can be filled out by and should be filled out by an accredited healthcare practitioner. Next, we're just going to talk about some general guidelines for completion of the J88 forms. You should obviously fill this form to the best of your ability and diligently and in full, in your own handwriting and with signatures on each page, your signature. You should avoid using any acronyms or unofficial abbreviations, such as any medical abbreviations that we use in our clinical notes. It should be filled out in English or Afrikaans, as these languages are official court languages. We should use exact descriptions. It should be medical and have legal relevance. Locations of the injury should be indicated on the diagrams that are provided at the back of the J88 form. Any alterations that you make should be countersigned by you and dated. There should be no blank areas in the J88 form. If there are areas that are not applicable, it should be strike through, and you should state the reason why that section is not applicable. And all legal documents are filled out with a black pen. Just some other information. You can submit the J88 report in other ways other than the actual J88. And you may include with reference and may attach your clinical notes, any laboratory reports, any X-ray reports, and any referral notes that are relevant to the case. And also, I think it's important to note that we are not the court, and we are here to provide an objective assessment of the incident, and so legal terminology should be avoided. If we are talking about rape, you need to specify whether it's genital, oral, or anal penetration. If it's sexual assault, you'd specify what kind of assault that is and if penetration is excluded. And things where consent comes into question would be where there's force used, where the patient is unconscious, alteration in consciousness, intoxication, younger than 12 years, or the patient is mentally incapable of giving consent. And then Richard will go through the completion of the J88 form.
So one of the important things we noted when looking at the J88 forms is that even though most of us have all had lots of lectures and teaching on how to complete the J88 form, when it actually sits in front of you, it's quite difficult to fill it out. So we're going to break it down into the parts of the J88 form so that at each part, everyone understands what we're going through. So when you open up the J88 form, it first comes to you with the front page. And at the top of the front page, part 1, it says for states of information, 1 stating the police station, the investigating officer, case number, and the contact number for the investigating officer. So the information is normally provided beforehand from the police station, already written on the form. If there is no patient with the J88 form and it's brought in by someone else, then it has to be accompanied with a SAPS 308 form, which will have the identical information to prove its legibility. As you go down into the next section, on the first page, there is, according to the Act 51 in 1977 for J88 forms, is that it enables the court, when you fill out this section, to admit the J88 form as evidence without the healthcare practitioner having to read it into evidence. This doesn't exclude you from needing to be called to court if they need further clarification on the forms that you filled in. In the next section, when you turn the page, the details of the practitioner is stated at the top. So most people get scared around this section because they worry about their information being put out into the public domain. But it is quite beneficial to fill in this section to full. But it is important to note that there is no legal repercussion for the cellular phone number section if you are not willing to fill it in. The next section, section B, is the patient information. At this point, you want to verify the patient's identity. Normally, most people use the identity documents that the patient will bring with them. You need to fill in the gender, the patient, who they're accompanied by, as well as in this section, you want to get the signature of the patient or the individual to give consent for the examination. It's important to note who can give consent. The normal rules of consent apply. The person must be 12 years or older. The parent or guardian must be present. Or the section gets superseded when there's a SAP 308 form with prior consent at the police station. It's also important to note who was present during the examination and what their capacity was, whether they're support personnel, interpreters, chaperones, anyone related to the patient. The next part is broken into two about the medical history in the J88 form, which is considered by the court quite an important section. So it starts off with first, when you look at the medical history, it's to note if there is intellectual disability in the patient or individual. And it's basically to first obtain whether there's normal intellectual function, if there's any obvious mental disability, and if it's already been documented before that the person has a mental disability, it should be noted, or if there's a concern that there's mental disability, that further assessment at your discretion needs to be taken. The second part is if there's any objective impairment, such as hearing or visual impairment, that should also be noted, and also there's further investigation by yourself if necessary, or referred for further investigation. The third part of the medical history is a list of complete medications that are relevant to the case, because in your clinical notes, you will have a full list of medications that you've done in your past medical history. And then in this section, you'll add in relevant medications to note whether there's interactions, side effects, anything that could affect the mental function of the individual or affect their ability to give consent for certain incidents. The fourth section talks about relevant medical history that aids with any sort of diagnosis, well, aids with your differential diagnosis. So this part goes into discuss their medical history, which will also be taken in full in your clinical notes. The next part of the history, when we're talking about between section 4 and 5, is the difference here, is that this section number 5 is the history of the alleged assault or rape. So in this part, it is also considered extremely important by the court that this is filled in full and is to the best that you can using the patient's own words, especially in children, because with children, their descriptions are not exactly the same as adults in all ways and how they describe things. So it's best to use their words so that it can be used by the court at a later date. In this section, you would also try to note everything the patient has said on top of what was used. So if there was an assault, what weapons, mechanism of force, and relevant actions. As well, if there was rape, you want to give some more information about date, time, the incident, and if there was penetration or ejaculation, or if there was any objects used. Then you move on to section D, which is the history of the sexual offense. So these sections can be struck out if not relevant. And as Adela said before, if they're struck out, they need to be signed and reasoned as to why. So this section, the first section, D, is the history of the relevance to sexual offense. It's a quick tick section as to has anything changed since the incident took place, and also about the normal physiological state of the patient. Moving on, section E is the general examination of the patient. Starting off with section 1 is to give the anthropometry of the patient. Also then to move on to section 2, noting the clothing that the patient has had at the incident, whether it was left at the scene, has it been changed? And if the clothing is available, what has happened to it? So it's important to note damage to these items, if there is any damage, or if there's any stains noted to it as well, because you can potentially and would recommend to swab the stains for DNA evidence. Note that these swabs are normally taken into evidence, and it's not just swabs that are sent in. You also have the ability to send in blood samples and urine samples. So here's Shazad.
Okay, so I'll be explaining further the section F, which is the clinical findings. So here you're basically trying to describe all of your examination findings or any injuries that you find during the examination of the patient. So it's recommended actually that you can number the all of your findings so that you can put to the corresponding number on the diagram at the end of the document. So it makes for easier identification. And this is an objective assessment. So it's basically what you saw and what you heard, smelled, or felt at the time of the examination. And then just to move on to a bit of describing wounds. So it's basically whatever you see during the examination, but using the correct terminology to describe it. So describing these wounds may give you an idea as to the likely cause of the injury. And common examples include incised and abrasion wounds, among others. So in terms of incised wounds, they are usually as a result of sharp force trauma. And most commonly in our city, we may see it resulting from a knife injury. The wound displays clean and sharp edges, as you can see in the picture. And if the wound is deeper than it is longer, then it's regarded as a stab wound. In terms of lacerations, you have tearing of the skin with the irregular edges and often accompanied by bruising of surrounding tissues. And you may occasionally find tissue bridging, which is basically strands of tissue going across the width of the wound. And they are usually caused by blunt objects. So it can be rocks or bricks or something to that effect. And then in terms of abrasions, so these are more superficial skin injuries. So there's incomplete penetration of the skin, and it's usually damage to the superficial epidermis. They can be caused by sharp objects, but in other cases you can get grazes or scrapes, which is caused with the contact with rough surfaces like tar or somebody that was dragged along or scraped. And then you may get imprint abrasions also with objects being imprinted on the skin, which obviously with a high enough force would result in an imprint being left behind. And then just a general but not hard and fast rule about healing of bruises. As listed below, this is a general color at the general date of the wound that appear, but obviously there are exceptions to this. Okay, moving onto section G, which is specific examinations of specific organs or systems on the body. So it's important for general assaults or in cases of rape or sexual assault. So the first section in G1 is the oral examination. So the sections that need to be examined are listed, and there's 8 sections there. So it's important to also note the frenulum of the tongue itself, and also the upper and lower lips. And it's advised that you get good lighting because it's often difficult to see without good lighting in the oral cavity. You can also note if there are any other structures in the mouth that are noted, like any other objects or foreign bodies that you may find. In terms of section G2, that's the anal examination. Again, the areas for examination are listed, but it's important to list any fissures that you find, any abrasions, swelling. You can also find any foreign bodies if in some cases. So that's also important to note. And in section G3, we have the male genitalia examination. So again, the sections are listed out, but if it includes kids, then obviously tender staging becomes one of the findings that need to be listed. And the penis and scrotum need to be examined well and thoroughly. Section G4 entails the gynecological examination. So here you need to, for children as well, tender stage is important. In terms of the common injury sites, so that's at the labia below the 3 to 9 o'clock lines, so which is the most common site of injury, as well as the fossa navicularis and posterior fossa, which are common sites of injury. So also commenting on the hymen as described, and if there's any discharge noted, those can either be sent off as part of evidence kits or either for culture, depending on the situation. Right.
Okay, so the next section of the J88 form is section H, and this just briefly goes through any specifics for specimens that are collected for investigation. If you're using a sexual assault kit, we just need to make sure that we note the serial numbers of the kits used, or for any other kits. And if there are any samples that are taken in, any cultures, discharges, or urine samples sent into the lab, then we should put the laboratory numbers. Just make note of those, and just take note of any additional medical specimens, such as collected drugs. Then section I is for any technology used. This would be used if there's any photographs taken of the injuries and when they were taken, and the name of the photographer that has taken these pictures, or any other additional aids that were used. And if toluidine blue is used, which I'll discuss in the next slide. Toluidine blue staining is a dye with a high affinity for staining tissues containing DNA and RNA, which is effective in picking up subtle injuries in the anogenital areas, which is a great help in PEDS cases as well. It's been shown to have a higher yield, about more than 20% in some cases, of detecting genital injuries as compared to just using the naked eye. Then the next section is section J. This is just for any additional pages used and attached. As we've stated earlier, you may attach any additional documents and pages, such as your clinical notes, etc. You just state the number of pages that you have added to the J88 form, wherever the space was insufficient for them. And you would just note on each of the pages so that they don't get lost. You'd put the station, the CAS number, and the name of the patient. Section K is for our conclusions. In this section here, we just motivate our reasons for the conclusions made. Our conclusion must be factual, it must be medical, and it must have appropriate legal language. We'd also just include whether our clinical findings are in keeping with the history that has been given to us by the patient For example, wounds first mechanism of injury. And we would consider where relevant any additional causes for the picture that has been portrayed by the patient, the probability, likelihood, and possibilities of the picture that has been portrayed. You also just want to avoid any specifics in the conclusion, such as knives, addresses, or weapons, or specific people, and keep to only what can be observed on the individual. Yeah, and I think you could also use this section to reference specific parts of the document or of the J88 that has led you to this conclusion. Section L, I think, is the last section of the the second last section of the J88 form. This is for the transfer details. This section is important to continue the chain of evidence, and it should only be handed to the investigating officer through a formal transfer. If the investigating officer is not available at the time that you want to do the transfer, the document should be kept in the patient's clinical file, and a time with the investigating officer should be arranged for a formal transfer. And then the investigating officer would just have to fill in their name and their details once handed over. The last section of the J88 is the diagram section. This is the section where we would draw our injuries onto the diagrams per our findings. And these can be obviously numbered according to the list of clinical findings in the previous section.
So once you have completed the J88 form after the diagram, some of the things that are important to note is to actually duplicate your J88 form. You want to keep one copy in the patient's records, the healthcare facility, and the original J88 form is the one that should go through the formal transfer and hand over to the SAPS agent. What is not supposed to happen is that we are not supposed to hand the forms back to patients and them to courier it to the police station. So in cases which sometimes is noted when healthcare professionals actually refuse to do J88 forms, there's actually a few moments that it is accepted. So one is when you're dealing with another medical emergency, you're allowed to delay and not do the J88 form right away. The other one is also if you view that the case that has taken place, you do not have the necessary experience or expertise to assist the patient accordingly and fill in the J88 form, you're also allowed to defer it. But now in these cases, if the healthcare practitioner does not wish to fill in the J88, and also when you're obliged to, the healthcare professional needs to stabilize the patient and then refer the patient to a center where they are able to fill in the J88 form. So the reasons why it's also important to fill out the J88 form is, one is it's satisfaction basically to the patient and victim. Gives them a piece of another port of call to deal with the situation at hand and to deal with the issue. So the one thing is the J88 is a useful piece of evidence, as it's been shown through studies in South Africa that it actually is aided in more convictions of criminals in South Africa. And the other thing is it actually benefits us as well as healthcare professionals, because you're actually developing a bond between you and SAPS. Because SAPS does come to the clinic at times and follows up with cases, and it helps you to build a safer community that you work in. The other thing is, when we're talking about the evidence collection kits that were noted in the J88 form, there should be healthcare evidence collection kits at the clinic, but it's not always the case. So in those cases, if you don't have the kits and you do really need one, you actually can request it from SAPS, and they are supposed to bring a collection kit to the clinic for you as well. So the kits in South Africa are actually manufactured by a company called Asino Forensics. And in each of the packs, if you've never had one before and you open it, there's actually a manual with step-by-step instruction on what to do and how to do each step of the collection. And as well, if you don't find these documents, there is an app that you're able to download on the Asino website that can help you through the steps of collecting evidence. So the next part of our presentation is the injury on duty forms. And Shazad will be.
Okay, so with our injury on duty forms, these forms are underwritten by the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act of 1993. which states that if an employee meets with an accident resulting in his disablement or death, such employee or the dependents of such employee shall, subject to the provisions of this act, be entitled to the benefits provided for and prescribed in this act. So they also go further to define accident as an accident, I'm not sure how correct that is, arising from the employee's employment, resulting in personal injury, illness, or the death of the concerned employee. So the procedure for this is pretty straightforward from the employer's perspective. So the employer and employee are to complete the WCL2 form, and the first medical report form, which is a WCL4, is to be completed by a medical practitioner. So this is just an example of the WCL2 form, which is filled in prior to receiving care at the facility. Well, if it's not an emergency, but usually this is already present and filled out when at the first consultation. So this is just the end of the WCL2 form, which has a small bit of instruction for the medical practitioner. I've noticed that these forms, they actually are differing versions of the form, and some will state that the form should remain at the healthcare facility and some may not state that. So I think it's safer just for it to be done in duplicate and a copy retained at the health facility. But this is more often the form that we will be required to fill out. So this is the WCL4 form, which is split up into different sections. And the first section is just basically demographics and the date of the accident. And as you can see, it's just employee and employer details at the top, which should be filled out as much as possible. And then the rest of the questions are pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. So it's basically a short report of the accident. You want to list all your clinical findings. So what you see, basically not what the patient feels. And you can describe any previous medical history or pre-existing disease that you find, whether x-rays were done, and the reports if available. Further on from that, you can list any surgical procedures. For example, if you sutured any wounds, and you can list if you've contacted any other practitioners for any advice or referral from there. And then lastly on this form, it's basically a declaration that you have filled out the form and you're happy with your responses. And this form, once completed, must be submitted via the employee to the employer for submission to the Department of Labor for any cases that will require investigation. So the WCL5 form is basically an extension of the WCL4. So if the occupational injury is ongoing and then this form is submitted, either as a final report once the patient's condition or illness has stabilized and requires no further care, or as an ongoing submission, usually on a monthly basis, to update the Department of Labor on the condition of the patient as such. So the two first sections on the form are the same as WCL4, which is the demographic information and the healthcare practitioner's details. So yeah, and this is an example of the form. So you've got a space to list any operations or procedures done. You can list whatever investigations you've carried out and what's the prognosis like and any further treatment required. And these just require dates of return to work, or whether the employee will not be able to return to work anytime soon. And then another form that's commonly encountered by us, especially at the clinics, is the disability grant forms. So there's multiple requirements for applicants, which includes age, among other requirements. But basically, these forms are filled out by a healthcare practitioner, and the healthcare practitioner states that whether we think that the patient would or would not qualify for a disability grant. But however, that's not the final decision, as SASA has its own independent board, so to speak, that actually makes the decision based on the investigation and the findings. So there's no publicly available or predefined list for conditions which qualify for disability grant, but it's most likely other conditions which will result in physical disability, or you can break it down according to systems such as musculoskeletal and back injuries, cardiovascular, such as severe heart failure or coronary artery disease, and respiratory conditions such as COPD or asthma. So basically according to each system. And yeah, these are our references. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any comments from any of the other family physicians? Anybody on board? I think there was just one comment I had about the J88 not being handed over to patients. You may find some instances where this is very challenging indeed, when patients come to an OPD wanting to get that filled in. And so there's a little bit of a challenge around. So keep that in mind. I think you may face challenges with patients, and you might have to indicate on the form that it's being handed over to patients to protect yourself, rather than refuse to give it to the patient. Sorry, I'm trying to find a way to. Go ahead. Any other